very exciting evening ahead of us, and I think before we kind of like talk about the speaker, I would love to thank a couple of people that have made this actually happen. So this is never just like, you know, like a one-man show, or it's always like a bigger team. And first of all, I would love to thank the McNay for kind of like hosting us here tonight, because it's an awesome venue, and I think like the collaboration with the McNay turns out to continue to be like a fruitful one, and we are very, very proud and very happy to have this happening here tonight. So let's thank the McNay tonight. I would also love to thank Lucifer Lighting for hosting us, for being like a sponsor of the event, and I'm very, very grateful for Suzanne to show us around with Alex and to just kind of like be a steady force in bringing great people to San Antonio. Thank you, Suzanne. We also have Tori here from the AIA. We are also working with them. I thank you, Tori, for always being on our side and kind of like, you know, understanding the spirits of architecture, but also like the value of bringing great people to San Antonio. You're always doing great, and I appreciate your help in making this happen. Thank you. So what brings us here? This is the College of Architecture, Construction and Planning speaker series. So I would love to thank actually Dean Browning for supporting and sponsoring this event. And also Sedef Dogner, the chair of the department. I don't know if she's here yet. If not, we'll just, in the spirit of thanking people, we'll just thank them in absence. So thank you for... So, I was put in a difficult position, although I invited Alex, to think about how do I introduce someone with the credentials of Alex Krieger. And I thought about it for quite a while. Alex has a career of over 40 years with countless awards and honors. And he's a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He's a principal at a major firm for planning architecture, operating globally, doing like large-scale, very, very important projects in China, actually all over the world. How do I introduce someone like this? How do I kind of like move forward quickly? Yes. Well, I knew that he would say this. But I still want to kind of like try my best to give you a little bit of a sense of, you know, not just who is here, but like I know him a little bit, and like giving a little bit of a sense what I think his accomplishments are, and I've kind of summed them up into like three things. I think like Alex played a major role in shaping urban design as a discipline, number one. Number two, I think like his knowledge about the American city is undoubtedly. And three, is this optimism about the way we live together. And I would love to kind of like spend like 3 minutes just to kind of quickly unpack this, and then we can listen to Alex. So what started out as a first urban design conference at Harvard University in 1956, organized by Jose Luis Sert, marked the beginning of a pursuit of an intellectual discipline and a profession and a professional focus distinct from architecture, urban planning, and landscape. Just 20 years after the historic event, and for an incredible 44 years at Harvard University in various positions, Alex has been at the forefront of urban design. So I would just kind of repeat this. He has been there for 44 years. I argue in his time at the forefront of urban design, he has distinctly shaped and reshaped the meaning of it, the way we understand it today. He has not only redefined urban design as a discipline, but his leadership also changed and challenged the ways we teach it. Currently, he is an interim chair at the Department of Urban Planning and Urban Design, a position he held twice in the past. He was also the director of the Urban Design Program and associate chairman of the Architecture Department at the Harvard GSD. In 2003, 2005, and 2007, he was honored as one of the outstanding teachers at Harvard University, and the Design Intelligence magazine's annual national survey named him one of 2007's Architectural Educators of the Year. His teaching is something that really not just resonates with me, but it resonates with thousands of people that have benefited from his insights. So not only have I personally benefited from Alex's teaching and insight into urban design, but he planted a seed into thousands of minds that took his class on the American city at Harvard University for over 30 years. So he taught the same, not the same class, sorry, Alex, but he taught this class for over 30 years, and it was one of the most popular classes on campus, with up to 400 students being enrolled in the class. His thoughtful approach to teaching not only captures 400 years of a vast variety of American landscapes and cityscapes, but his invigorating way of presenting the complexities and patterns of settlement, urbanization, and urban life elicits us about its possibilities. He not only seeks to dismantle the cultural processes, policies, planning, and design actions which have influenced American urbanization, but he also outlines the love-hate attitude Americans have shown towards their cities across history. Whether this is evident in utopian imaginaries and pragmatic efforts, rapid urbanization and sprawl, or smart cities, with the global population surpassing 7.7 billion people, his contributions illuminate how urban design has become more crucial than ever. His teaching and scholarship not only chronicle the evolution of urban design, but his criticality always puts perspective to the current state while anticipating the challenges of the future and how the profession will need to adapt to confront them. Most notably, his work is published in his books on urban design, 2007, Remaking the Urban Waterfront in 2004, Mapping Boston in 1999, Towns and Town Making Principles in 1991, a design primer for towns and cities in 1990, and Past Futures, 2 Centuries of Imagining Boston in 1985. Most importantly, however, is this third part that I want to quickly just outline, is the way his new book kind of like brings it all together. As I mentioned before, in his book, is based on more than 3 decades of teaching and writing about the American city. The book displays the integration of his work as a teacher, practitioner, and scholar. It is rare that these 3 sometimes rather opposing realms are so organically brought together by Alex. As a matter of fact, I believe he embodies them. His latest book, however, goes beyond all of his previous publications, where in the past, Alex has focused on the physical environment of the city, characterized by material objects and spatiality. City on a Hill encapsulates the environment of objects and spaces as much as it does the environment of laws, regulation, rituals, and cultural sensibility, and most importantly, it makes room for the environment of all humans and species. It is a book that touches us all, whether we are architects, planners, citizens, residents, Americans, or immigrants. The City on a Hill captures what made this nation great, from the Puritans in Boston to Chicago's Columbian Exposition of 1893 to today's smart cities. His book illuminates how cities are closely linked to imagining a more utopian future for the nation. Alex offers not a theoretical construction, but as a means to remind us that the American city is not a product of divisive polarizations, but his view is a glimmer of hope in how persistence and dramatic consequence of utopian dreaming have actually shaped this country. Please help me welcome Alex Krieger.
So, of course, that introduction was probably the highlight of the rest of the evening. What's happening here? So, thank you, Professor Petrov, and it's great to be here in San Antonio. So, today I'm going to speak about, this evening, I'm going to speak about optimism, which is not much in evident across American culture today. What you're seeing here actually is the opening day of the the visitor center at the Empire State Building, and of course, not of course, but the cover of the Sunday London Times talking about the incredible New York, right? And imagine in the late 1920s or early 30s, even in the Depression, how unprecedented New York must have been. All right. And the other thing I would note, of course, is the most utopian of all aspirations for the nation, right in our Constitution, to form a more perfect union. And again, these things, so for 400 years, America has sort of evolved with a certain amount of optimism and a belief that the future will be better than, of course, the present, much less the past. It doesn't seem to be... it's making a sound, right?
Yes, it's making a sound. But maybe there? I don't know.
No. I don't understand.
Maybe now. Yeah.
Yes. So, we're sort of accosted now about, an incompetent Congress and, of course, unbelievable inequality. If you just focus on that chart a little bit, it's hard to become optimistic. Or, of course, not least of which today, new fears about the coronavirus and so forth. So amidst all of this news, it's hard to maintain a sense of optimism, but I'm going to convince you, I hope, over the next 45 minutes about how American civilization and American urbanization has evolved out of a certain amount of sort of aspirations about a better future, even kind of a somewhat kind of utopian aspirations, though searching for utopia doesn't assure getting you there. So I'm not naive in this regard. But that does not mean that you should not search for utopia, and there have been many challenges. So the book that Professor Petrov was referring to is called City on a Hill. And I have to start by describing the strange aspect about its title. By the way, the book just came out a couple of months ago, and look, there's already a film being made of it. That's pretty good. It's kind of exciting. Of course, it's not true. I wish it was true. It happens to be, there's a new television program in Boston. The City on a Hill is a slogan that's associated with the city of Boston. There's a new television program about what? About corruption, municipal corruption in Boston. Some of you may be watching it, and so the film is about that. This was not even my idea for a title. This was given to me by the publisher, but it makes a certain amount of sense outside of Boston. So, City on a Hill, of course, the term itself, at least in the Northeast, dates back, we think of it as, Governor Winthrop, carrying the flock of Massachusetts Bay colonists to settle New England, has a sermon right on the boat, and he says, "As a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people upon us." He was saying, you better be good. If you're going to be sitting on a hill, you better be good, and better be a kind of an aspiration for those who might follow. Actually, he was paraphrasing Jesus Christ from Matthew, who said, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden," again suggesting that if you want to occupy a hill, you better do so with sort of the best of intentions and the best of values. Now, to some extent, in the post-war period, when we were, very braggish about how we've saved the world, a number of politicians, including Ronald Reagan, began to talk about America as a city upon a hill, and kind of, in that case, related to this notion of American exceptionalism, which one could argue about whether that's a good thing or not, but America as a kind of beacon of hope for the world. For my publisher, it was just a kind of great preface for the actual title in my mind, which is Urban Idealism in America, from the Puritans to the Present. So we have to go back in time a little bit, right? So at the time of the kind of discovery, the Western discovery of the New World, right? And you can see it says Die Neue Welt in German. This is a German map. Actually, this is, of course, the first Utopia, the novel Utopia by Thomas More, was inspired by the discovery of a new world. And in this fairly common map, Christian map, which showed at the time, of course, the three known continents of the world, Jerusalem at the center, and there was an expectation that somewhere in the world, paradise might still be there. Obviously, it was there sometime. It must still be there. Where is it? And there was an expectation that, if you see this quote from a kind of an Aristotelian scholar, the America would lead to nature, well, he said to Christ first, to nature and to paradise. So since the discovery of the so-called New World, we don't call it that anymore, there was this notion about it if not finding paradise, the opportunity to kind of recreate a paradise. Or an even more famous quote by John Locke in the 1680s saying, "In the beginning, all of the world was America," suggesting that this was a time, this was an opportunity to create a new beginning, a better beginning for humanity. So the book traces that attitude through various moments, some very successful, some not so successful across American history. And the kind of the millions who came seeking a better world, and those who are still trying to come, despite difficulties today, still believe somehow. And I'm actually an immigrant myself. I came to this country as a boy with my family from Eastern Europe. So the book is 18 chapters, and the great thing is you can just start anywhere. It's individual moments in the kind of evolution of American urbanization, and you can just read it willy-nilly or stop, or just look at one that happens to catch your fancy in terms of its title. And I'm going to go through some of these chapters, and also not on an order, just to confuse you, all right? Okay. But now, as the poster out there, so that was a very good choice, Antonio. So if there was only one, the book is very, very well illustrated, but if it only had one illustration, it would be this one right there, right? This kind of says it all, good and bad. So there's American Progress, there's Lady Progress. She seems to have a laptop in hand. That was pretty good for, kind of the 1870s. It's not yet wireless. The wire's trailing. She's actually laying telegraph cable. Ahead of her are fleeing Indians, those indigenous people that we kind of forgot were here first. The good colonists are sort of following her to the promise of the West. And again, the reason I say this, so there was always this sense about, again, new beginnings and improvement. Although, again, this manifest destiny thing also caused a few problems, especially for those people who were fleeing ahead of her. But she's also doing something else which is not often recognized about this painting, which is she's also leaving St. Louis. St. Louis is the town way back there. If you know about the Eads Bridge, you can see it right there. So that's the kind of the double whammy here. America was always about progress and progressivism, and starting again, improving somewhere else, but leaving the places already established. And that's what is not such a kind of a noble aspect of our history, right? She's not trying to make St. Louis better. She's trying to create a better St. Louis somewhere else. Okay, so we can't start. So chapter 1 deals with the kind of the most, the person, Thomas Jefferson, one of the kind of founders, the third president, who had the clearest idea about what America should become. And what it should become was, it would be a nation of homesteaders living free and clear on a large piece of land. And of course, his own homestead right there being a Monticello, it'd be good if each of us had a Monticello. That didn't quite happen. But as you fly across the country on a sunny day, you still see actually much evidence of his idea. He authorized a surveying of the West, the Midwest at that moment, into kind of very regular grids. And each of us was entitled, although it didn't come to pass until much later, I'll get to that, to our own quarter section. The quarter section, I'm sure a term you've heard, refers to a quarter section of a mile square, which the grid laid out, 160 acres. And so you and I, as long as at that time we were white and male, had access to a piece of America, and through that access attained a certain amount of liberty, freedom, economic self-sustainability, and, of course, the anticipation of a better life. And this is no joke. This notion that one could create an egalitarian society was something that was very much in the minds of the founders and visible on the land as a consequence of this survey. Now, there were a couple of problems, right? Most of these homesteads, especially in the South, what's trailing down the hillside of this bountiful landscape and this amazing plantation are slave quarters. Took a while to get rid of that, right? By the way, if you've not visited Monticello since you were younger or with your children, go back again, because finally, after a long time, there's a new exhibit there in honor of Sally Hemings up there, who was a slave. She took care of Thomas Jefferson's kids when his wife died. She also became his concubine. She fathered 6 children by him, 4 of whom lived into adulthood. This was for 150 years denied by various people who thought this was obscene. But you can see the kind of so-called other family. DNA evidence has proved that indeed there's half of the family of the descendants of Thomas Jefferson are of a different sort of race and color. All right, so we never quite got, except for these happy farmers there, in Nebraska and so forth, we never got there, but we sort of got the second best thing, right? We sort of got our quarter acre or our eighth acre as we moved into the 20th century. And again, there's an awful lot of criticism now against suburb and sprawl, and you're either enjoying it or criticizing it. I won't ask for hands of which one is doing which, but of course, after a century of suburbanization, we're exposing some of the kind of limitations of such a life. But for most Americans, for most of the 20th century, this was pretty close to the notion of becoming an egalitarian landscape as Jefferson imagined, again, not quite at the scale of a quarter section. But now let me shock you a little bit as I show Thomas Jefferson crying. So there he is crying, right? Because wherever he is, he does not like this map of America, because of course it's precisely the opposite of what he imagined. He imagined that each of us would have the benefit of our 160 acres. This is a map that translates economic inequality to land ownership. And it's kind of stunning, and it's worth not forgetting, right? So look at that, right? So 1% would own most of the West. And 40%, which probably would be most of us here, would own that little dot in the lower part of Texas. So somehow, again, this kind of utopian aspiration to create an egalitarian, equalitarian, actually for Jefferson and the founders, an agricultural republic, has become one of the most kind of land speculative societies on Earth. Okay. The second chapter, and I will not go chronologically, I promise, through all 18 for sure, right? The second chapter deals with another kind of perpetual mythology about American culture, which was certainly prevalent in the 19th century, which was the expectation of living within nature and in the garden of the world, living in a society in the middle of the kind of the plentiful, bountiful environment that the world provided, consuming it, not yet worrying about consuming it to the point where we are consuming it, enjoying it, but also in consuming it, still consuming it in two ways, in terms of our needs for food and shelter, but also in terms of appreciating it, right? So nature's nation was a great expectation. We need to think about that as to how close we're getting to this at the moment, as opposed to how far away. And it's kind of represented here in terms of an amazing collection of paintings, a moralizing set of paintings produced by Thomas Cole, a great painter, who tells you where we should be, right? And so, of course, the first is the archaic state. That's not so good. That's wilderness. There are bears and things, right? It's not very, look at that. The storm seems to overwhelm the sunlight. There are kind of creatures and things in the foreground, not a very place. The second state is the pastoral state, kind of a little bit like that of painting as well. The third state is what we've been doing, consuming empire, kind of a Roman scene. The fourth state, of course, which Cole was saying you have to try to avoid, and this is 1830, right? The fourth state being, of course, the destruction of empire. At that time, of course, the fear was not that the planet would be destroyed like we think now. We would be destroyed. Look, you know, the hapless warrior there, kind of not being able to stop the arrival of storm. And then the fifth state is the kind of the resurgence of the planet, the dissolution of empire, and perhaps heading back towards the pastoral state, which all of the transcendentalists also suppose. So again, here's Thomas Cole as a figure in a painting, along with William Cullen Bryant, Go West Young Man, of Go West Young Man fame, enjoying the American landscape, enjoying it, again, in several ways, consuming it also for pleasure, not just for food and so forth. And there's still plenty of places, actually closer to where you guys live than where I live, of the kind of awe, the majesty of the New World, still there to be sort of consumed in the positive sense of the term. A young family enjoying their overlook over the Grand Canyon, very much like Thomas Cole and Mr. Cullen Bryant. So that was the great expectation, belief, very much still involved in many sort of American sensibilities, even if it's kind of sort of a little bit hidden. And about half a century later, there was a need to try to reintroduce nature into, by that time, of course, the sort of monstrously growing, especially kind of industrial cities on the East Coast. And so these folks, the Olmsteds, senior and junior, the bottom of the image, it seems to be, well, it's okay, most of it is there. They began to suggest that in order to save us from the very cities that we were building, we needed the kind of the healing aspects of nature. And one of the great contributions to urban design internationally is the incredible park systems that were built in a variety of cities across America. Not just Central Park, but the Boston Emerald Network and the Kansas City Park System, which is even more amazing and no one knows about it. And you know, the Dallas Park System, the Kessler, one of the kind of interns at the Olmsted firm. So this was a moment in time when this notion about if nature's nation was seeming harder to achieve, we needed still the healing aspects of nature to be brought back within the fold of the city. So if we move ahead, or actually move backwards, since this is chapter 8, if we move backwards, another great kind of a association, a sensibility, still very much with many Americans, right, is this notion of not the suburb. We may live in the suburb, but we imagine living in a nice small town, the hometown, right? And many of the most current suburban developments under the rubric of new urbanism and so forth are, in a funny way, still trying to kind of convince us that the best kind of life is not so much in the center of our industrial cities, but the best kind of life is in a place, from our memories, somehow, an idyllic environment, again, somehow in response with the natural world. And so we can see this, right? We can see why the suburb has been such a powerful force. It goes all the way back to Jefferson. You could say he was the progenitor of the suburb. I don't think he'd like to be thought of that way, but he was in a way. And the transcendentalists and those folks who wanted to kind of live in a nature's nation, right? So this is one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. This is a young family about to take ownership of their first home in one of the Levittowns. Again, a little bit more modest than up there. I can fill sort of books with images like this. That is kind of the idea of a family with children enjoying the possibility of life, not in kind of lower Manhattan, not in some kind of tenement of the industrial city, but this scene of sort of wholesomeness. The dad seems a little bit disenfranchised back there, but I suppose he participates as well. Now, there are preachers. The suburb dates back, of course, to the beginning of the 19th century. They were called garden suburbs at the time, on the periphery of cities, not intended to replace the city, intended to kind of be a kind of a place to go in the evenings and weekends to separate yourself from the kind of a rasping friction of the city. Eventually, of course, as most of us moved out there, we began to kind of replace the city with these things. And preachers during the 19th century would refer to grace dwelling there. Kind of an interesting idea. And it looks like this family is experiencing some sort of grace, even with their new television that the kid seems to be interested as well. Well, what did that take? What did that take to produce, not for those who with means, but for the rest of us? Well, it took Autopia, which is chapter 12. The next book that I hope to write, I'm not sure I'll get to it, would be based entirely upon car commercials, car advertising. You could write a very great history of American urbanization in the 20th century just with car advertising. And this is, I think, the best advertisement ever, the best car ad ever, in my opinion, right? The car itself becomes the place, right? It's not, the Buick doesn't get you to a place, there's no place like Buick. In this case, the dad seems charged up, the mom is not so convinced back there in the background. But there it is, right? There's no place like Buick. So, of course, one could not have grace dwelling in it for tens of millions of people without, of course, this particular invention. And its inventor, right, was not shy about telling you what should happen, right? We shall solve the problem. This is Henry Ford, of course. We shall solve the problem of the city by leaving the city. A very kind of apt and actually often, whether stated as directly as that, often believed situation during much of the 20th century. We shall solve the problem of the city. Frank Lloyd Wright would say this all the time, too. He was a great fan of Henry Ford. We shall solve the problem of the city by leaving the city. Again, imagine once more Lady Progress with her laptop leaving St. Louis rather than improving St. Louis to create a better version of St. Louis or indeed a better version of a city. So again, another great car ad. Look at that. It'll lead you astray. Isn't that wonderful, right? It'll lead you astray. And by the way, it also says, and you will like it. And you will like it. All right. Now, interestingly enough, and I bet you might be surprised, a great hater of cars was Walt Disney. He thought that, the kind of the sprawl and outside, he hated that around Disneyland, the first one, right, all of a sudden became pocketed with, strip malls and all kinds of stuff like that. So he decided that he would produce a better version of the city. And I oftentimes ascribe sort of utopian sentiments to a number of things. This actually was a utopian venture, not the way it was built, but the way that Walt Disney imagined, which was Epcot, right? And for Epcot, in his mind, and this is not what is now, of course, a part of the Disney World in Florida, what Epcot was going to be was a better version of the kind of slummed mid-century Rust Belt city, St. Louis, Cleveland, Detroit, name your pick, as well as an improvement over the suburb, which already was gaining some kind of problems in terms of the kind of the lack of interest that people have living out there by themselves and so forth. So he was going to invent a perfect balance, a perfect middle landscape between, of course, the dead city, dead industrial city, and the no longer interesting suburban expanse. And Epcot was going to be it. It was going to be a place where people lived and worked. Notice there are no cars whatsoever. He had his engineers produce these amazing drawings where the cars were below ground and the service area below ground. And the surface was going to be a little downtown, actually a convention center, a ring of of higher density housing, then a ring of lower density housing, and people who were going to live there would work in the factories, also in Epcot, work in the places of work, and the places of work would create innovative things, like a better refrigerator, let us say, and the people who lived there would test out the product, the better refrigerator, prior to then, of course, going out and marketing it to the rest of the world. And I would encourage all of you, actually, to do a YouTube thing. Go to YouTube and put in, Epcot, Walt Disney, and you will still see Uncle Walt there describing his utopia. Some kind of a perfect balance between suburbanization, still living kind of within a natural environment, so-called, while still kind of becoming a kind of a very progressive urbanite, without cars, by the way. Now, unfortunately, he dies about a year after he announces Epcot. Of course, by that time, he buys, or his company buys, millions of acres of land in Florida. And so Epcot continues, as we now know it today, not like what he imagined at all. It's just another kind of little amusement park. His brother takes over the company, obviously, after Walt passes, and the Imagineers, who were very excited about Walt's Epcot, would say, "Gee, let's go forth." And of course, the brother would say, "Well, Walt's dead." And of course, with Walt's dead, died this other kind of utopian fascination about the best of both worlds, the best of a kind of a suburban environment, wholesome for families, and the best kind of urban environment as well. And so chapter 5 deals with a long history of trying to kind of perfect where labor should be in relationship to the city, usually away, and nature itself, right? And there's a long history of placing labor outside of cities in order to kind of create a healthier environment by all the kind of the great kind of city builders of the 19th century, the Lowell Mills and so forth, and then the kind of the places like Pullman, Illinois, and so forth, to move industry outside of cities, to avoid all the distractions, to provide a healthier life for employees, and of course for them to become more productive as well. That was kind of a real paternalistic aspect. And so, kind of long history. If you can go from the kind of the great mill towns up in New England to the kind of the various sort of company towns like Pullman, Illinois, to, of course, in mid-century, to the great diaspora into the suburbs, not of people, but of labor. But then recently, of course, as we are kind of rediscovering urbanism, or some of our kind of corporate captains of industry and so forth are rediscovering urbanism, there is this little pull back towards the city. This is Amazon headquarters, obviously in Seattle. Nature now is kind of contained in a ball. And then, of course, with this comes the prediction of the end of the suburbs. This is not a very good book, so don't bother buying it. And don't you believe it, actually. The suburb will not grow to the extent that it could. How could it? It can't grow exponentially. Most of us are there. But it's not going anywhere in terms of providing a kind of a perfect moment for a perfect portion of one's life. Basically, your kind of child-rearing, family-building part of your life. And the reason it's not going to grow very much more, and the reason that the city's coming back, is the fact that we are all living longer, and the percentage of our lives dedicated to family building is narrower. The young are staying young much longer. They have no need for the suburb. The old guys like me, hopefully, are staying on the planet longer. We don't need to mow lawns. And so, if you were living in 1920, you grew up, you married, you had kids, they grew up, you died. Slight exaggeration, right? But today, kids stay kids into their 30s. And then, they leave, and we still have a couple of decades of hopefully good times, including, by the way, there's actually a trend of old people moving closer to their kids who are living in the city, their adult kids, right? So the reason for it's not all of a sudden that we discovered we love cities all of a sudden, after a century and a half of trying to create a better version. The reason is that, it kind of has to do with actuarial tables, right? If we live into our 90s, right, the percentage of our life for whom the suburb is a ideal environment keeps shrinking. So that's why the suburb is not going away, but why more people are discovering the benefits of the city, including the return, of course, of companies like Amazon trying to kind of re-engage the young entrepreneurs who are living there. Okay, let's pause on this moment, and this is to kind of try to, create a guilt on the current Congress, our current useless Congress, right? So here we are in 1862. President Lincoln is signing the Declaration of the Proclamation of Emancipation. But within 3 months of this, itself an amazing act, 3 other acts are passed by Congress, which have been enormously influential to the history of America, even to this day, and were as kind of utopian acts as one can imagine, each one. So the first was, of course, finally the institutionalization of the Homestead Act, Jefferson's idea about us, each of us, by this time women could apply to, our own 160 acres, and I'll show you a little piece of it. Then there was the kind of the moral act, not as in morals. This was a Mr. Morrill, a senator, having to do with the creation of our upper educational system, the public educational system. And then there was the kind of the granting of millions of acres of land to railroad companies to, of course, make it easier for Lady Progress to get us all away from St. Louis. Right. So this is one of the great land rushes, an incredible moment. There were 7 of them. As, of course, pressure to settle the West increased, former indigenous populations that would move to this area were asked to kind of move again, and periodically Congress would establish another set of acres for white settlement, let's call it that, right? Or for this homesteaders, right? And so here's a proportion of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and of course this looks like just Hollywood, right? The idea that something like this would actually happen just seems, just like Steven Spielberg stuff as opposed to the reality. Well, look at that. Here's an actual photograph of the land rush. An actual photograph, right? On a certain day, the military stepped aside from this border. The Congress had released 2 million acres for white settlements. For months, upwards of 60,000 people arranged themselves along the border, waiting for that fateful day and the bugle call to allow access. Kind of amazing. By the way, if you divide 2 million acres into 160-acre homesteads, that's only like 12,000 people, but 60,000 people had assembled in order to get their piece of America for free. Let me read you a little snippet of an actual boomer, and it's kind of amazing. This is the way much of America, the Western America, was settled. So, and now the hour of 12 was at hand. That's when the kind of bugle was sounded. I remember throwing my blankets out of the car window the instant the train stopped. So there were also trains that were carrying passengers, those folks who didn't have their own horses or kind of stoga wagons and so forth. I remember tumbling after them through the same same window. Then I joined the wild scramble for a town lot. By the way, not everyone wanted 160 acres. Who wants to be a farmer? They were trying to figure out where the towns would be and get a piece of land close to where the action would be. Right? Then I joined the wild scramble for a town lot up the sloping hillside. There were several thousand people conveying on the same plot of land, each eager for a town lot, which was to be acquired without cost, each solely dependent on his own efforts. I found myself, without exactly knowing how, about midway between the government building and the depot. Now, these were not buildings. They were signs that would say government building to come, right, or depot to come, right? It occurred to me, this guy's smart, it occurred to me that a street would probably run past the depot. I proceeded at once to unstrap a small folding cot I brought with me, and by standing it on end, it made a tolerable center pole for a tent. I then drew a couple of my blankets over the cot and staked them securely into the ground. Thus I had a claim that was unjumpable because of substantial improvements. That was the way you kind of took possession of land, by showing how you improved it. I felt safe and breathed more freely until my brother arrived on the third train with our tent and our equipments. Amazing, amazing way in which sections of the West were settled. Again, this notion about making a better life somewhere else from where you came. And so this is Guthrie, Oklahoma, 4 days after its founding, right there, right, with all those unjumpable claims now. And of course, oddly enough, Guthrie, Oklahoma went from 0 to 12,000 people, and it's still at 12,000 people in 2020. So the Homestead Act was a sort of amazing, finally, act of Congress to enable each of us to create our own kind of homestead at either 160 acres or in a good town lot next to the future railroad depot. The second great passage of, think about what our Congress has done in the last 3 years, nothing, right? Think about the importance of these. So this was the Morrill Act. By the way, it produced one of your most important institutions. The Morrill Act essentially created public education in America. The Morrill Act, and this is Mr. Morrill up there. I don't know how many of you know. It's forgotten, despite whatever Bernie Sanders talking about free public education. The Morrill was the Bernie Sanders of his day. He may not have called himself a socialist, but he said, "Look, Harvard or Princeton or Yale, what are they good for? Not much, right?" They're still teaching classical knowledge and so forth. There's no access for the rest of us to those places. So what the Morrill Act did was that it established a policy by which the federal government would give any state upwards of 30,000 acres of land for free, actually times the number of congressional districts, by the way, right? It tended to favor the northeastern states. By the way, this was the Civil War, so the southern states were not voting for this. There's a little trick about how Congress was able to pass all these great things. But the Morrill Act, and the state could take that 30,000 acres, could do whatever the heck they wanted with that, sell it to speculators, but they had to use the resources to create a public university devoted to not classical or Latin, right? Classical studies or Latin, devoted to applied subjects like agriculture, engineering. Actually, the kind of institutionalization of agriculture is the basis of these places. Engineering is a profession emerged from these. What we now call STEM, right? We're now kind of obsessed with sort of STEM education, right? Essentially, that was this 19th century version of it. And as you can see, 70 such institutions were created, essentially most of our public educational universities around the country. Think about that. Think about what an act of Congress can do, although seemingly not today. And the third kind of act was to establish then a policy of funding intercontinental railroad lines. And so this, of course, allowed Lady Progress to keep leaving St. Louis and Detroit and Cleveland and so forth ultimately. But the railroad companies were pretty shrewd, and so they would create these kind of posters. So getting you to go to California, we're still kind of seduced by these things, right? Look at this, the cornucopia of the world, 43 million acres of government lands yet untaken, climate free of health and blizzards, although sometimes I think of it as buzzards, right, which may be equally right. And the amount of land dedicated to these purposes was just enormous. Look at this. Look at Nebraska. Look, a kind of a huge chunk of it. The government would not just give you like the 5 feet that you needed to build a rail corridor, right? But because to allow, of course, being able to kind of negotiate topography and so forth, 10 miles to either side of the line was also granted. So these railroad companies walked away with millions of acres of land, which, by the way, most of which they then sold. That's, speculators. And then there's this kind of poster up there that sort of critiqued this policy, because why? Why would this policy be critiqued? Because it would seem to have limited the number of homesteads that would still be possible under the Homestead Act. All right, but those three things were kind of completely transformative of American society, including still today with the fact that we're enjoying all of our public education systems. And we might need another Morrill Act to come to try to make them affordable again for most of the people. All right, so when I wound up here as a 9-year-old, I wound up in Chicago. So of course I cannot help but bestow some, and I'm getting close to the end, so bestow some attention to Chicago. So that's chapter 11. And I refer to Chicago as the original Amazon. And this is no exaggeration whatsoever. It's not a kind of flight of fancy. Chicago was the original Amazon, and some of you probably know this, right? By the way, stop complaining about your traffic, right? So around 1910, right, Chicago was the kind of the real sort of furnace state of modern urbanization. Actually, there's expectation it would supersede New York. By the way, it was growing so fast. And it was the sort of center of the spider's web, right? being the point at which the Great Lakes and their access eventually to the oceans, right, intersected with the railroad system that the transnational companies were working, and so that was the home base of American industry, right? So some of you might recall Sears, even though it's got out of business. And what was it? Or Montgomery Ward. They were just like, what's Amazon, what do they call the warehouses? Something centers. Innovation, fulfillment centers. There's a fulfillment center from the 19th century. And just like now, although it took a little bit longer in time, right? You could order anything from a Chicago warehouse, from Montgomery Ward, and this is 1870, 1860, 1880. You could order anything, and it would get to you by train, including homes, including fashions, including, of course, armaments, and don't pay attention to this kind of electric belt. I'm not sure what the hell that is, so close your eyes there, right? So it just took a little bit longer than today, but indeed Montgomery Ward was the original Amazon, right? And indeed, for all of the attention that Henry Ford gets for inventing the assembly line, right? Baloney. Way before Ford even imagined his Model T Ford, there was the most incredible assembly line on the planet, the purpose of which was not to assemble machines, was to disassemble animals for food. One of the reasons actually for the victorious North was that 40,000 steers and animals were disassembled in Chicago, many of which feeding the Northern Army during the Civil War, and becoming an entire huge pork town that created jobs for not very good jobs, but always very sort of promising jobs, right? A start, just like, of course, Henry Ford's automobile workers a couple of decades later. And Chicago also built this sort of magnificent World's Fair in the 400th anniversary of the discovery, the Columbian discovery of the New World. And the importance of that was, other than bragging about the arrival of Chicago on the scene of important cities in the country, but also around the world, was that the World's Fair really was a kind of a utopian apparition. Most utopias occur in a literary sense or through drawings. This actually took 3 dimensions, and it captured the imagination of Americans. 27 million people visited this fair. The population at the time of the country was 56 million. Now, that doesn't mean that half the people in the country visited that, but still, astonishing, right? And astonishing. But ultimately, besides, of course, putting Chicago on the map, the World's Fair, which of course was temporary, made out of plaster Paris, and was going to soon be fallen apart, actually led to the actual design of the nation's capital that we know today. The original plan dates back, of course, a century earlier, but who needed a capital back in the 1790s? And for much of the 19th century, who cared about the capital? Who visited the capital? No one, right? It was just a tiny little place far away. So it was not until the end of the 19th century, with the inspiration of the Chicago World's Fair, that, of course, the kind of imperialistic aspects of our capital began to take shape as, of course, America then joined the kind of the world of important nations and was starting to compete with them. Look at that. That's our nation's capital in around 1890, right there in that photograph. All right. I definitely am getting close to the end. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on the utopia that is Las Vegas. Anne, my wife, has not forgiven me for putting a chapter of Las Vegas in this book about utopias, but she is wrong, right? Las Vegas happens to be the location of 2 American utopias. And they're both quite important, right, for society. So on the one hand, of course, yes, it's the kind of the place for vices, as kind of in your sort of as the Chamber of Commerce itself tries to promote, right? But that's the kind of utopia of what? Of getting away from it all temporarily. In other words, the slogan that you hear, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, is actually not the real slogan that you use. The one that you use, what's at home and what's at work stays at home for those 3 days or 5 days of my world-class vacation at middle-class cost. So that's the kind of the utopia of the getting away temporarily from your daily cares. And by the way, you literally land in paradise, a town called Paradise, when you land in Las Vegas. And parallel to it is a huge, sprawling metropolitan area. I bet some of you don't think people live in Las Vegas. More than 2 million people live in Las Vegas. And it's one of the last bastions of the achievement of a middle class for people without much education, for people who are working at relatively, not very high-paying jobs, who can still have access to that American dream of a home and yard, though it is in the desert, right? Las Vegas, a typical worker at a casino can earn $100,000 or more. And given that, the land costs in Las Vegas, actually up until recently, were very low, given the plentiful land available for development, actually, immigrant families, almost nowhere else on the planet now, could find themselves a steady job of reasonable pay and therefore acquire their version of the American dream. It's not available now in Boston. It's much too difficult in terms of cost. Las Vegas is also sometimes referred to as the last Detroit. Why? Actually because of the labor union, the casino workers are part of a fairly important labor union system that sort of assures them reasonable pay, benefits, and so forth. So on the one hand, there's the Las Vegas of getting away from your daily troubles temporarily. And then there's the Las Vegas for a couple of million people who might otherwise not have access to their American dream still being possible out there in the desert, as opposed to most places, most metropolitan places around the planet. So that's why I think Las Vegas belongs in this book for kind of utopian aspirations. So lastly, and I promise lastly, Chapter 9, perhaps the most important one for our own age. Chapter 9 deals with the first great sort of urban age. We're sort of experiencing the second urban age as we all start to love the city, or so we think we are, right? And at the end of the 19th century is when, of course, the American city was rapidly growing, industrialization growing incredibly exponentially. But at the same time, somehow, something else was happening. At the same time as, of course, the city was exploding in terms of economic benefit, and what we now call plutocrats were called robber barons at the time, right? This was the kind of it was called not only just America's urban age, but it was called, the age of enterprise, the American Renaissance, the Gilded Age, the City Beautiful era, but also the age of the robber barons. And the Bezos of the time were robber barons, not whatever we want to call them, Mr. Bezos, right? And so, for example, I just recently wrote an article about Boston's Gilded Age today, and it is. And yet, something different was taking place there at the same time. So yes, the City Beautiful era, the Gilded Age. Read that quote. It's a weird statement, but not entirely untrue. It's preposterous, but not entirely untrue, right? So of course, during that period of time, there was the tremendous outpouring of investment in the public realm, and the courthouses were built, and the libraries were built, and the kind of statuary in all of our parks were built, and indeed the parks were being built, and so forth. All that was happening. At the same time, of course, all this was still happening as well. The prior time in this country was this tremendous separation of kind of equity in terms of economic equity, at least. So in addition to the robber barons that were there at the time, there were people like these people, almost all forgotten, except that all of their books 100 years later are still in print. You can get them in most bookstores. You can certainly get them at Amazon, for sure, cheaply, right? And you should read some of them, right? You should. Because they were the kind of the other. They were sort of somehow suggesting, right, that as we built great courthouses, we should also improve the lives of the rest of us. And so during that same period, a tremendous amount of sort of progressive reform was taking place, largely because of these people, in terms of zoning regulations, in terms of laws against tenements, windowless bedrooms, in terms of ventilation, in terms of sewerage, in terms of avoiding, not the coronavirus, but, cholera, right? The planning profession was being sort of invented at the time. All kinds of regulations against sort of municipal corruption was taking place, largely through these people and others themselves who were trying to kind of avoid or minimize the despair that was there just as frequently as there was, of course, great Gilded Age prosperity. So I encourage you to look at these books, or come of them. They have relevance to today. And so I'll end actually with this, of course, one of my heroines, Jane Addams, who created settlement houses with which she worked with immigrants to try to kind of improve their lives and kind of adapt them to kind of their new circumstances in their kind of new places. So she goes, the good must be extended to all society before it can be held secure by any one person or any one class. But we have not yet learned to add to that statement that unless all and all classes contribute to a good, we cannot even be sure that it is worth having. An incredible statement that suggested that somehow during that period of great growth and inequality, a reciprocal condition was taking place that at least tried to kind of overcome some of the despair that was facing most of the kind of recent immigrants that were popular in our cities, that were working in the kind of slaughterhouses in Chicago and so forth. So I'll end with this image and these sort of two quotes. This is, of course, Chicago's great kind of a lakefront. And I would love for Americans to kind of somehow recapture the aspects in these two quotations about a century apart. Of course, Carl Sandburg's famous quote about Chicago, his poem to Chicago, but especially that stanza, laughing the stormy, husky, brawling laughter of youth. It'd be great to return to that sensibility about the American city. And then, of course, as most Europeans have always understood, right, embedded in the idea of America is the idea of the modern age. They are synonymous. And yet somehow we're falling behind this idea as well. So with that, let me stop. And I hope that I found a way to kind of make you think at least that a certain amount of optimism ought to return for a period of time when we lack that. But we should take solace from the 400 years of optimism that actually built America. Thank you very much. I was going to say something about the smart city, but that'll just ruin the evening, so I'm going to go back to this view.
Questions? Oh, it does work, yeah.
Well, there's a gentleman there who's brave, right?
You left us with, I think, a good amount of optimism. I was wondering, though, if
I'm not sure I left you with optimism.
You didn't have much good to say about Congress. Do you think they might have any good to offer us?
I'd like to avoid talking about the current Congress, yes. Well, go ahead, you're in charge.
Yes, how are these ideas that we're discussing being embedded in local communities with leadership, whether it be city or county or state governments?
Many of them originally were kind of based upon kind of local organizations, right? You know, there was no kind of national policy about suburbanization. There was a lot of public subsidies for continuing suburbanization, but originally it was usually small groups of people who said, hey, we have a kind of better way to kind of organize ourselves. We're going to buy a piece of land. And there's a great, for all the talk about, socialism, and I'm sorry I even said that word, because all of a sudden tomatoes will be thrown here. Communitarianism has been a very fundamental aspect of American culture. Now, The difference is that communitarianism was about a particular group, right? It was not everybody, right? A particular group. But that sense still about operating in a group, trying to improve the group, not just me individually, trying to improve the group, even though, of course, they were segregationist in their own way, being a group rather than all of us, right? Has been a fundamental aspect of American culture from the Puritans onward, right? And I could have spent much more time in the chapters that deal with the kind of the hundreds of religious communities, hundreds of sort of social communities that populate America during much of the 18th, 19th, even 20th century, even the kind of the hippies of the hippies of the 1960s, who are all trying to kind of make a better world for themselves as a group, not for themselves as individuals. Yes. Yes, right, yeah. By the way, the Mormons, right? The Mormons built 400 cities. 400 cities. All of them under a kind of ecclesiastical mandate to create a place that was communal in organization. One of the kind of incredible innovations, now, not often realized, but still, there's an idea about how in a Mormon city, laid out on a grid, they bought the grid business from Jefferson, right? They thought they got it from God, but they got it from Jefferson at the same time. The grid, in that case, the grid was laid out in a way that your house would face your neighbor's garden, not the front door. So there was this kind of amazing idea about a checkerboard where I could benefit from your garden, and he could benefit from my garden rather than having things face each other across front doors with the private enclaves behind and private, right? So again, it's an example of kind of amazing moments when under the aegis of at least communitarianism, there was these moments of trying to kind of make a better situation for us, though the us was always small rather than universal, right? Good question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this enlightening presentation. So as a smart city coordinator at the city of San Antonio, I am actually quite curious about what you had to say about smart cities and was wondering if you could expand on that.
Well, this, of course, is the operational center for, as you can see, right, that is trying to kind of make that city smarter, right? All they're doing is managing traffic mostly, right? So for a city to be actually smart, it has to be socially smart, not technologically smart. At the moment, I think we're too enraptured by the kind of the software that we're being sold by, the kind of the Amazons and IBMs and so forth of the world, as opposed to thinking about what makes more socially smart cities. So that's my only critique, right? There's just got to be a way to kind of think about this, again, from a sort of, I don't want to say socialism, please don't, from a kind of social equity standpoint rather than from a technological standpoint, because who benefits from all these technological advances first? Not people, broadly speaking, but of course those who are already doing reasonably well, right? So how can you make a smart city that first extends the smartness more broadly to the population as opposed to enable those who are, smart and well-off and so forth, have the kind of latest gadgets at our fingertips. That's my only critique against the smart city at the moment. Right.
I was wondering, do you see a relationship between Paulo Soleri's Argosanti bringing a city into a superstructure and the relationship to what's occurring today with a reawakening of the urban core and people coming back to the cities?
Well, so would I kind of explain it? Paolo Soleri was a kind of utopian, and he was an Italian kind of theorist, architect, planner who went out there in the desert somewhere in this part of the world and just started to build a beehive, a kind of a city-scaled beehive. And it's still in operation. There's still people devoted to this thing, and they're building things at kind of one little stone at a time. They're funding it by selling little trinkets, bells and things, right, that are produced there. So there's a small group of faithful that are still involved in building Acrosanti, which is the name that he had for his. If you think about Buckminster Fuller back in the 60s with his geodesic dome, so there's a kind of period in the 60s when these kind of a technocratic utopias were beginning to be imagined. His, of course, was going to be built by hand, right? But the question is, does that have that instinct to kind of build a city, does it have some relationship to this, our seemingly newer interest in urbanism? That's very much visible, although exaggerated, greatly exaggerated, We place all of that, we say the millennials as if they are all exactly the same type, right? And the millenniums like to live in micro apartments on top of Starbucks. Forever. Except the millennials are now reaching into their mid-30s and 40s. They're now shacking up. They have kids. And guess where they're going? 65% of millennials are moving back to the suburb. Why? Because, of course, a yard is not a bad thing to have when you have a couple of kids. The schools are better out there. Oh, and by the way, it's too costly to live in San Francisco or Boston or some of our most successful cities, and they can't afford it. In my architecture practice, there are young people who we'd love to hire and can't live in Boston, right? And that's where this new slogan, which is so kind of frustrating, slogan that says, drive till you qualify. I'm sure you've, right? For a mortgage, right? Yeah. So again, yes, after a century and a half of thinking about that, but nature's nation pulls us away from cities. And of course, during the end of the 19th century, industrial cities were, if you were working in a slaughterhouse, you were not having the best time in the world, although you still had a belief in the future. So it explained why we became enamored of the suburb. And by the way, what was the one example of the most affordable housing ever created for the middle class? The suburban house. That's affordable housing. Thanks to the GI Bill, thanks to the interstate highway system, thanks to expanding electricity and water and sewerage, thanks to the low-cost long-term mortgage, and a substantial amount of federal subsidies were behind the creation of the suburb. We now say, well, the feds, what can they do for us? They did a heck of a lot on behalf of the suburb. The question is, what can they do for us now that more of us want to be located in a more dense environment? What should those subsidies be when we want to be closer together? So oddly enough, our sort of newfound love for the city is creating this kind of an existential crisis having to do with unaffordability. Oh, and by the way, climate change as well, at least in terms of many coastal cities as well. So I don't know. Acrosanti and Paolo Soleri is influential in the notion of a polis. We all kind of want to be citizens of a polis. And he was creating one out of mud, somewhere in the desert. But whether or not actually it represents the dynamics of urbanization or not, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Before you guys go, if you brought a book, Alex is happy to sign a few copies upstairs. There's like a desk, and we can meet you there, and we could sign a few copies. Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you.